Hello, and welcome to our webinar on the Historic Preservation Fund and managing your grant project. This section will be on grant basics and best practices. My name is Megan Brown. I'm the Chief of the State Tribal Local Plans and Grants Division at the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. Our division is tasked with managing all of the grant funds that come to us from the Historic Preservation Fund appropriation by Congress each year. Let's get started talking about some Historic Preservation Fund grant basics. The Historic Preservation Fund supports the work of the National Historic Preservation Act, which was established in 1966. The fund, which came into existence in 1976, is the source for preservation grants and financial assistance to states, tribes, local governments, nonprofits, and other partners. The funds are administered by the National Park Service on behalf of the Department of Interior, and funding for the HPF, Historic Preservation Fund, is derived from offshore oil and gas lease revenues, not tax dollars. The idea being the extraction of one non-renewable resource should lead to the preservation of other irreplaceable resources like your project. There are a lot of acronyms in the world of historic preservation, and these are just a few that you're likely to run into through the course of managing your grant project. So it might be a good idea to print this page and just have it available. We do our best to not use too many acronyms, but we can't help but slip into the federal talk sometimes. Let's get into a little more detail about your grant agreement and the requirements that you'll find within it. There are a lot of requirements for federal grants. Most of those are listed in your grant agreement, so it's a very good idea to read it closely and go over it carefully. That agreement goes into effect when both parties sign it. So you as the grantee will sign it first, and then you will return it to the Park Service, and we will sign. And at that point, it becomes active. You can also find information on how to manage your grants on our website as well, and we'll give you more information on that as we go through the webinar. So what should you look for in your grant agreement? Well, there's a lot of information in there. It's over 30 pages long, but these are kind of the key areas, and we're going to touch on these a little bit more during this exercise. Places to focus on a series of articles, checking out the statement of work that talks about what you're going to do through the project that's been funded. The term of agreement, this tells you when the start and end dates are. And we'll talk a little bit about extensions later. Who the key officials are. The ATR, or Agreements Technical Representative, is your Park Service grant manager that you'll be working closely with throughout the process. The AO, or Agreements Officer, is the person who's responsible financially for signing off on the grant agreement for the Park Service, and that is actually myself, Megan Brown, who's the Chief of the State Tribal Local Plans and Grants Division. The budget is also an important place to pay attention to. We'll look at that in a little more detail. Reports and deliverables, so this is the products that we want to see from you. Subgrant information, should you perchance be subgranting. Indirect costs, are you allowed to take them, and what is the approved rate that you're allowed to take? Competitive selection, all grants are have to have competitive selection at the federal level, so this is an important section to understand. Review and compliance, how you're going to move through the Section 106 and the NEPA, or National Environmental Protection Act, process for review. And then there may be special conditions or articles, usually at the end of your grant agreement, that may center around the level of risk that your organization might have. So it may involve extra reporting, extra financial reporting, backup documentation, accounting information, or perhaps some additional submissions to your State Historic Preservation Office. There are a lot of places to find information on grants, but we want to direct you to these two main resources. For the Historic Preservation Fund program specific requirements, you can look through our Historic Preservation Fund manual that's located on our website. And in addition, you should be familiar with the OMB circulars. 2 CFR 200 is the most important one that lays out requirements for all federal grants. Now let's talk a little bit about the specific sections of the grant agreement to pay attention to. The first one is your budget and statement of work. This is the place where we talk about what you're going to do and what part the money is going to go to. Both can be changed if needed. We realize that both are best guess at the start of the agreement, so we do expect changes throughout the process. We also do expect that you track your administrative costs, so that will be seen as a separate budget item. You should contact the Park Service if you're having a more than 15% change between the categories and tell us why that's happening. And if you have a change in scope, so maybe you get into your project and the architect recommends we need to shift things around. Those are all possible things. We need to know what the change is and what the timeline is expected for that. Both of these are great items to present in your interim report and tell your grant manager that you need a change at that time. This is just a quick example of what a sample budget will look like in your grant agreement. You can see in the first column that we've broken out the administration charges. This project is not going to charge any direct administration. They are mainly focusing their federal funds on contractual consultants and then construction. If they were to, for example, shift more than 15% of the construction budget into something like equipment, supplies, or their consultant, that is when they'd need to get approval from the Park Service for a change. Another section to pay attention to is deliverables, and this is the products that we expect to see throughout the course of the project's life. The grant agreement lists what these are. They do vary by project, so your project's not going to be the same as someone else's. We do want to see drafts prior to the final version. That's very important, and it's a lot easier to fix things at that point than when you're finished. The final versions are due with the final report, and we do appreciate digital submissions as we are also running out of space for large paper reports and things like that. I mentioned extensions earlier. Most of the grant agreements are going to start you out with 2 to 3 years for the project. If you're making good progress, extensions are allowed under certain circumstances, and we usually do those for a year at a time. So with a large construction project, you may see yourself seeking multiple extensions, and that's okay. We just want to be careful that we're not setting that end date out too fast. This is also a great thing to request in your interim report. We do want to make sure that we process an extension before your grant date ends or expires, because that becomes much more difficult for us to do. When you're working on your publications and deliverables, make sure, as we said before, that drafts are approved by the Park Service first. And we want to make sure that this disclaimer acknowledgement is present. So partially funded by whichever grant program you're working with, of the Historic Preservation Fund, National Park Service, Department of the Interior. Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this material do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Interior. It's important that we see this in your publications, so we will check for it. The Park Service also has a right to republish the publications or deliverables, as well as use photographs submitted. So please provide citations and photographer information so that we may give proper credit. All consultants should be informed of this requirement so they aren't dismayed when we might use a photograph that they took or reference of a publication that they created. Use of the Park Service logo is allowed, but prior permission has to be requested, and you need to request that from your Park Service grant manager. A little bit more concerning this topic with public relations and endorsement. We do want to see that you credit the Park Service and the Department of Interior and the HPF in any publicity that you have. So press releases, although they should ideally be sent to your grant manager for prior approval, need to at least have the similar disclosure statement. You may not be able to fit all of this in, so at least crediting the Historic Preservation Fund National Park Service is, at the bare minimum, is key. We do ask that a press release be posted in your local newspaper within 30 days of receiving the signed grant agreement back from us. You need to submit a copy of that to the Park Service with your interim report. This is important because this provides public notification for the Section 106 process for us as the federal agency, so it does need to take place. You should transmit any notice of public ceremonies to the Park Service, so we might attend and support you if we are able. Do not publish anything that implies the Park Service is endorsing your organization or a particular consultant or contractor. And in any public relations, the Park Service and the Historic Preservation Fund must be credited. Let's talk a little bit about best practices, just to keep in mind as you move through the grant management process. Some things to think about. Your grant file should really tell the story of your project without having you there to explain it. Something might happen to you. It does happen. It may shift to a different part of the organization. You might have a new grant manager, those types of things. So it is important to have a really complete grant file. We'll talk a little bit more about what needs to be in there. It is our job at the Park Service as grant managers to make sure that you're managing your grant properly and are in compliance with all the requirements. So if you do have questions, please reach out to your grant manager, and that is why we're here, and we want to help. Don't just guess. Go ahead and ask the question. And a well-managed grant is a great form of advocacy for your organization and for the Historic Preservation Fund, so we ensure that funding continues to come to it. So what should be in your grant file? Definitely your grant agreement. It's the document that makes it all happen, and any amendments to it, so extensions, changes in the budget or scope of work, etc. Guidance and communication from the Park Service. So if we're emailing back and forth or writing letters back and forth, copies of those should be in your grant file. Financial documentation, so receipts, invoices, timesheets. Even if you aren't submitting them to the Park Service, you should have them in your grant file for audit. How you evaluated and chose your consultants or your contractors. It's important to have review notes, bid documents, so you show that it was a competitive procurement process, something auditors like to look for. And then any reports that you've submitted, interim and final, or any documentation that shows you've completed the Section 106 or NEPA review process. It's a good idea to also have an organizational chart explaining the roles of who was involved in managing the grant or working on the project. Also, explain any materials you might have given to the public or presented to the public. Any relevant timelines and action plans, and maybe how those might have need to be altered and changed. And any canceled contracts or related explanations. So if something went wrong, you want to document what happened and how you corrected that. For all the elements of the files, you need to maintain those for at least 3 years for audit purposes, 3 years from the close of the grant when everything is complete. That's the end of this session on grant basics and guidance. If you have further questions, you can contact your grant manager at the State, Tribal, Local Plans and Grants Division. You can see our contact information here. Our website is nps.gov/steelpig, STLPG, and you can find resources there for all of our different grant programs. Or feel free to shoot us an email at preservation_grants_info@nps.gov. Our phone number for our main line is 202-354-2020. We thank you for listening, and we look forward to working with you on your grant project and success for the Historic Preservation Fund. Thank you.